Fourth and final section of the Administration Support Program pre-departure. This section is on adjusting to life in the U.S. We'll be talking about American culture, values, and the university environment, smoking in the U.S., personal safety in the U.S., sexual harassment, and cultural adjustments. So first, a brief overview of some common American values. First of all, America might be different than what you expect. It's actually a very diverse country. Approximately 33% of the American population is non-white. About 81% of Americans live in urban or suburban areas, and 90% in rural areas. And each American region is different. The South is quite different from the Northeast, which is quite different from the Midwest. So each of you will probably have a somewhat different cultural experience, and we think this will really add a lot of interest to your experience. You'll get to see different parts of the United States, share your experience about the similarities and differences between different parts of the country. On this slide are some values that are thought of as kind of general, overarching American values, although as mentioned in the previous slide, each region is a bit different and will have a slightly different location. But these are some typical American values that you may encounter. One is informality or equality. You may especially note this in the university environment, that dress is quite informal. Most typical kinds of dress in the university environment is what we would call business casual, and if you're not familiar with that term, you might want to look it up and see what kind of dress it implies. But there are always occasions where you might want to wear a suit or nicer clothing. Also occasions where you may see people dress very informally, and so you may also want to bring some clothing for outdoor activities, barbecues, or more informal activities. Along the same lines, you might notice that people address a fairly informal way in the US, and especially at universities. Students may call their professors by their first name, and in most cases, colleagues call each other by as well. Directness or honesty. Some people have noted that they think that Americans make a lot of eye contact while speaking, and this is considered a sign of respect and honesty. Some other typical American values are individuality, belief in progress, diversity, focused achievement, and punctuality. So these are all things to keep in mind as you come to the US. Just keep these in the back of your mind and having interactions or having meetings as to how these values might come into play. Here's some more specific key cultural points. In the US, we tend to allow quite a bit of personal space, so be sure to pay attention to how much personal space around an individual people tend to allow when speaking with each other in a conversation, or especially when waiting in line at a bank or automated teller machine. Especially in situations involving money, you may see that people leave quite a bit of space around others. Another note is generally men and women do not hold hands, link arms, or hug or kiss members of the same sex in public, even close friends. Most common form of greeting would be a handshake between colleagues. Close colleagues or friends might hug each other upon greeting. And finally, Americans expect everyone to arrive on time. You might hear the phrase "time is money," meaning that most Americans find their time very valuable and don't like to consider it being wasted. So being late for classes or appointments is considered rude. You'll want to try to arrive on time or even a couple of minutes early for any meeting, class, formal appointment. Smoking is another thing worth discussing. These days in the US, smoking is prohibited in most public buildings and restaurants and enforced in fines, so you should assume that smoking is prohibited indoors until you hear otherwise. On some university campuses even, smoking is prohibited outside on campus grounds, so you should be aware of that as well, that is the case on some university campuses. Smoking is generally not acceptable in private homes either. You'll want to ask your host if you're visiting someone's home first before smoking. Cigarettes cost an average of about $6 a pack. And in general, before smoking, if you're in a group, ask those around you if they mind. Some people are very sensitive to smoke or the smell of smoke and would prefer not to be around it. And finally, if you do smoke, you should prepare yourself for receiving comments about the unhealthy side effects of smoking, as some people in the US do have strong opinions about this and won't be afraid to share them with you. During your U.S. fellowship experience, you'll be placed at a designated host university. As I mentioned earlier, each city and town in the U.S. has distinctive regional characteristics and is not necessarily representative of the U.S. as a whole, so keep that in mind that each area is different and each area will provide a unique cultural experience. Some of you may already have received information about your host placement. In some cases, these are still being finalized, and you'll receive information very soon about your host university. We, of course, want you to stay safe while you're in the U.S. Generally, the United States is a very safe place, but you should always be cautious and aware of your surroundings and observe these basic safety tips. The first of which is try to avoid carrying large sums of cash when you can, so over about $50 or $100. If you do have more cash than that, please keep it in a safe place, in a lockbox or something similar in the place you're staying. You shouldn't hitchhike, which means to get a ride from a private car. It's illegal in the US and generally speaking unsafe. So take a registered taxi instead of hitchhiking or find an alternate means of transportation. Don't at any time leave your bags unattended. First of all, they may be stolen, or secondly, especially in airports or other areas, they may be viewed as a security threat and may be confiscated. And in general, just be aware of your surroundings, what's going on around you. I would say be especially cautious if you're walking at night or in an area that does not have a lot of foot traffic. So just be careful in that sense. This slide has a few notes about sexual harassment. So, as in any country, customs for interaction between men and women in the US may differ from those in your country, and you may hear Americans discussing the issue of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment means unwelcome sexual advances, including physical or verbal behavior, which has the effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. This may include things like commenting on someone's appearance, or touching or invading somebody's personal space in a way that makes them uncomfortable. Those things can all be considered sexual harassment. So this is something to be aware of, and Americans take this issue very seriously and discuss it openly. Finally, we want to talk about cultural adjustment or culture shock, as it's sometimes called. Much of what is distinctive about the culture of the US may be a new and different experience, and these differences can be the source of both excitement and irritation. Almost everyone who goes abroad for any length of time will experience some degree of culture shock. And even if you've been to the US before, the particular circumstances of this trip may be different, so you should be prepared for some degree of cultural adjustment. But although people react differently, comfortable and manageable, becoming familiar with the symptom-typical triggers will help you manage this cultural transition. 5 stages of cultural adjustment. The first stage is called the honeymoon excitement stage, where everything seems quite new and exciting. You'll want to experience things. You are learning a lot and exposed to a lot of new experiences. However, the second stage is culture shock, where you may feel isolated or lonely, alienated by being in a new culture. It can be a difficult period of time. After that comes adjustment or recovery, where you perhaps begin building more relationships and find a way to balance the new exciting experiences while maintaining your traditions from home as you need to. That leads to a period of adaptation or stability where you feel comfortable in your new environment, and then you go home and the cycle might repeat. Most people, when they go home, do experience a reverse culture shock where they're getting reaccustomed to the way of life in their home country. A few tips for cultural adjustment are to just keep an open mind and be patient. Keep in mind that culture shock is normal and manageable. If you're going through a difficult period, there's not something wrong with you. It's very common, and you'll be able to get through that stage. In general, observing how others are acting in the same situation can help you navigate difficult cultural moments. You can also try to find a friend or other international resident to share your experience. This can be especially helpful if you have a confusing or stressful experience. You want to do a debrief with someone who's been through it before. You might find another international resident who has more experience in the US to talk it through with. Finally, take care of yourself. Get plenty of rest, keep a good diet, and exercise. Keeping yourself healthy can improve both your physical and your mental state and help you be more resilient to culture shock. If you find yourself feeling isolated, look for opportunities to join with others through group activities and socialize with new acquaintances. And finally, your host advisor or your IREX program administrator, we're always here to support you, listen to your concerns, so don't hesitate to go to your advisors at your host university or your IREX program contacts. This brings us to the end of the pre-departure training. I hope you found this information useful. I'll be speaking with you in the coming days to see if you have any questions and to go over some of the more important points of this training. But of course, if there are any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me in DC or bring your questions with you to the opening workshop and we can discuss them at that time. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it, and safe travels to the US. We're really looking forward to seeing you. So long.